Dr. Roberts is going to talk to you today about the T-Snip, which is a test for tolerance and toxicosis. So, Dr. Roberts.
Okay, thank you. Let me...
I took that slide out from yesterday.
Well, I have to have it in there. I get in trouble. University of Missouri, our administration is pushing the faculty to have startup companies. It's new in agriculture, but it's commonplace in medicine, has been for many years. And we've had a startup company since 2003 where we used near-infrared analysis, NIR, to measure soybean quality and did that for soybean breeders. We also developed germplasm. And so when this test came along, it went into that company. So the company wasn't formed for this. But you can imagine a clod-kicking agronomist working with lawyers. And after 3 lawyers looked at this is what they agreed. So I have to say that portions of this talk describe T-Snip testing. T-Snip is not affiliated with the University of Missouri, but is technology commercialized by the startup company Agbotanica LLC, of which Dr. Roberts, that's me, has a financial interest. I'm sorry, I have to do that. And I have a long paper trail that ended up there. The first thing to say is, I'll say it several times, there is no such thing as resistance that we know of. I started working in fescue toxicosis in 1980, so I hit the 35-year mark. It was my master's project, it was my PhD project, I postdoced with it. And I've known some of these folks here for a long time. And I've never seen any resistant cattle. In Missouri, we hear of this, and then some of our animal scientists go down to the Ozarks and they'll take a potload back to campus and put them in controlled environments and run tests and find out, no, they're not resistant. They may have some improved tolerance, and that's what we're talking about here. So on the one hand, you can exaggerate. On the other hand, improved tolerance can add up to a lot of money. So you don't want to overplay it, but don't want to exaggerate it, underplay it, I guess. And let me say this also as a disclaimer, lawyers aren't forcing me to say, but I know there's some animal geneticists in the audience, and just remember I'm an agronomist and that this test is proprietary, okay? It's not a patented test. It falls under the intellectual property category of the Coke formula. So, its management is the key. Management is the key. And this publication, Joe referred to that earlier. This is something that John Andre and I had written up in 2002, and it came out electronically in 2003. Then it was revised and published in hard copy in 2010. And the only reason for saying all that is a lot went into this publication. It's the summary of many books and many proceedings. There's a long history of fescue toxicosis, fescue foot, fescue poisoning, whatever it was called, all the way back to 1939. And this is 18 pages, full color. And it's what we call everything you want to know about fescue toxicosis, but we're afraid to ask. It's an easy reader, and it was written for the progressive farmer. It wasn't written for scientists, but everything in here should be accurate. It's heavily reviewed by scientists. In the hard copy, there's this flow chart, and this flow chart is the overall strategy for handling tall fescue. You know, every forage has its own limitation, its own advantages. In the case of alfalfa, how many of you grow alfalfa? We're a little south, but some of you may grow alfalfa. What kind of soil do you grow alfalfa on? Sir? Clay. I couldn't hear.
Clay.
Clay? Okay. That's what you grow it on personally, probably. But what's ideal for alfalfa soil, I guess, is my question. It's well-drained soil, and it's soil with a pH above 6. Where I live, I mean, if you do that, you also drive a Cadillac. I mean, we don't have soil above pH 6. We have soil above pH 4.5 sometimes. But alfalfa has that limitation. We also have annual Lespedeza. Annual Lespedeza. You have to manage annual Lespedeza with your eyes always on receding. Always have to let it recede. So every forage has limitations and strengths and weaknesses. In the case of fescue, the number one thing to think about is toxicity. It's toxic and it causes toxicosis. It's what most people have been already talking about this morning. And so this chart, we're not going to go through it, but if you test for the endophyte, most of them will be high, as you heard John say this morning. And the ideal management is to replace it with a novel endophyte. No matter what else is said here today, even if it costs money to me, there's nothing more important than replacing toxic fescue with a novel endophyte. If you can do it, have the land and so on. But there's this other part of our forage livestock operation across the state and all fescue belt that says I'm not going to for whatever reason, and I'm going to manage it. Okay, now that's not what I advise, but if you're going to manage Kentucky 31, what are the management practices? This also was published about 2004, also with John, and it's a proceedings that was stretched into a book. We asked all the speakers to write liberally, so not just your talk, but write a bunch of stuff in there that surrounds it so we can have book chapters. And there's a book chapter in here, chapter 18, that talks about education on fescue toxicosis and how to get the message out. And inside of the chapter is a list that we call Eldon Cole's 97 Witches' Brews. You know, fescue toxicosis draws a lot of home remedies. You probably have heard some of these. You know, treat the ground. Somebody's tell me how to treat the ground. But there's so many of these, and so Eldon, who's a livestock specialist in the Ozarks, started compiling this list. And you can imagine, how many of these 97 do you think work? Well, let's look at these 97. Breed this. Don't breed this. For the same breed. You know, breed Gelbvieh. Don't breed Gelbvieh. Breed Simmental. Don't breed Simmental. I mean, this list is just a series of contradictions in breeding. Feed this and feed that. Feed what? Feed oregano. Feed cinnamon. Feed anything. Yes. And I'm not going to say that. But that's one of them too. But you can say it. Spices. Pet milk. Somebody had the practice of injecting pet milk into the brisket. Chase the cattle around with the four-wheeler. You heard Glenn talk earlier this morning about vasoconstriction. Well, if you can't get blood out to the hooves, just chase them around with your four-wheeler. I think that's how you lose weight. That's how I lose weight. Well, you know, there are 97 of them. How many of them work? Well, I'm learning more and more about chaparral that I don't think anymore we can consider chaparral new and untested. We're seeing enough to know that it goes on the list of things that can work. But really, if we look under management, forget this. We're saying, okay, it's not low. Safe to say in here, nearly all of you have hot fescue. We're not going to replace it yet. I hope you'll reconsider that. But I'm going to manage for now what I have. What are these practices? Well, summer grazing is a good one. And we have a lot of Bermuda grass in our Ozarks. You probably have some here. Pasture dilution. In other words, legumes, but we also dilute our pastures with grasses. Anything but hot fescue is dilution. And diet supplementation with affordable doses, you might say affordable rations with soy hulls or something like that. These work really well. Then there are also some things, buy local cattle. Why would we say buy local cattle? What happens to cattle if I bring in a bunch of cows from Texas or from I shouldn't say Wisconsin, but I guess I could. Wisconsin. What's going to happen to those cattle in the fescue belt? They're going to fall apart. And so local cattle. Low nitrogen fertilization, you heard some of this, or John will talk more about that. Ammoniating hay. There's some other things that work, clip seed heads. But out of that list of 97 suggestions or practices, which is now over 100, less than 10 would have any scientific value. Most of them don't work at all. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about buying local cattle. When you talk about looking for genetic variation in a herd, in the cow herd here in Virginia, say, you really are talking about local cattle. You know, these herds have been culled. So we're going to talk some about a management tool that is, it's a genetic test for fescue tolerance, not resistance, fescue tolerance. And the test can be conducted on blood or hair or semen. And talk just briefly about the science of the T-Snip. When we talk about this, what we're talking about is the conformation populations. There's a little bit here on the development population, but not much, and that's not a discussion that we're going to have. So mainly on this, does it work? I forgot to say this also. When the University of Missouri decided to go into what they call economic development, faculty startups and entrepreneurship, they also brought on board somebody who works in an incubator, they call it a business incubator, who advises all the faculty, because here we are scientists. I don't know anything about business. We just rattle off everything. He says, no, you can't tell anybody that. Okay. But so the rule he says is you just tell them, does it work or not? That's all you need to know. So I'm focusing this morning on confirmation data. Let's take a little bit of look, though, at a study like this. We're going to look at 205-day weaning weight, and we're going to look at, these will be heifers, and they're eating non-toxic fescue, if you want to say Pennington, Barenbrug are here today, one of theirs, or they are eating toxic Kentucky 31, all right? Now, I'm going to put some heifers on this non-toxic fescue. Think of orchard grass. I'm going to put some heifers on orchard grass. And one group of heifers is susceptible, highly susceptible to toxicity, to toxicosis. The other group of heifers is tolerant, you know. So what do you think is going to happen here? Nothing. There's nothing because there's nothing to cause any difference. In fact, the difference that you're selecting for is not going to show up because you're putting on something that's non-toxic. They're going to behave the same, and that's what happened here. What's going to happen if we put them on toxic fescue? Well, it's like this. The heifers that are susceptible are going to have weaning weights that are 112 pounds lighter than, well, put it this way. The difference between no toxin at all and susceptible heifers is about 112 pounds. The difference between no toxin at all and tolerant cattle is about 56 pounds. That's why we say tolerant. If they were resistant, these heifers would go all the way up, and they would gain just as if they were on non-toxic. Well, they don't. You only get about half back of what you would have lost. Average daily gain, that may look different, but it's not. So there's no difference in gain. But if you put them on toxic fescue, these here see a 41% increase. These cattle that are tolerant have a 41% increase in gain over the heifers that are highly susceptible. There's also not shown here an increase in intake. It's 8%. Now, some of this is in development, but the rest of this is in confirmation trials. And so we would go to farms. This was tested on 8 farms, some in multiple years, and I'll show you the data for the first 4 farms. And what happens here is this T-Snip test will grade out cattle from 0 to 5. It's a star system. So if they have 0 stars or 1 star, they're highly susceptible. If they have 4 stars or 5 stars, they're tolerant. And that's what's being compared here. Nothing in the middle. And there are a lot of cattle in the middle. So here, susceptible, what we would do is test the cow and weigh the calf. So here, the susceptible The susceptible calves from susceptible cows were about, on average, about 50 to 58 pounds lighter. Okay? Again, that's not resistant because they're not getting it all back. They're not gaining 100 or 112. And this is Farm A, is tested for 3 years. Farm B, the same thing. Farm C, the same thing. Farm D, the same thing. And there are 4 other farms with multiple years. They're showing the same thing, that the difference between highly susceptible and tolerant is about 56 pounds. And here's what I call the spaghetti graph. If you like XY plots as a researcher, this is 14 site years of weaning weight where we plotted the weaning weight based on the T-Snip score. And we actually used things more than just the score. We used the actual numbers that are not reported. But the R-squares for the scientists in the room, the R-squares on this average 0.63. That's not R. That's R-square. The p-value was 0.01 on all 14 except 1. That means they were highly significant. A p-value tells you if it's significant or highly significant. 0.01 is considered highly significant. The one that didn't get a 0.01 got a 0.02. So these are very reliable data. There were 3,000 observations in this confirmation. So let's talk just briefly about how to take a test for this analysis. You can go to this website here. It's the Ag Botanica website. Most of these tabs have to do with near infrared and things like that. But the first tab is on this T-Snip test, and there's a little video that you can play about just a little bit of the data are in there. It's a 2-minute video. But if you click on this tab, there's the website, agbotanica.com. If you click on this tab, this page comes up, and there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a progress bar so that you can do this. It's a setup really for people to do testing online. So they would register, order cards. Our cards come from Nebraska. You're probably familiar with Neogen or GeneSeek, Igenity. It's that same group of labs. They do our testing. But you can order the cards for $1 a sample. Then you print the forms. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then go ahead and collect the samples. And if you're willing to pay online and have them mail, it's much easier to handle because all your data come back as records. They're email records. But again, sample hair or blood. We're nearly all doing hair right now. So unless you specify you want a blood card, you're going to get a hair card. But just take the cards after they're filled out and fill in here the cow number, cow ID, and fill out the barcode, and then you mail it off. I'm not trying to run a commercial. I feel like, Joe, you're running a commercial, aren't you? It's an infomercial. But it's $29 is the cost of the test. People always ask that. So how to manage with this? This is a very important question. It always comes back to management. And I'm with Joe on this. The Fescue has created much grazing area and prevented soil erosion over millions of acres in the United States. Yes, it has problems, but we can manage. So some general comments in terms of management. And by the way, the hair coat sometimes shows up and sometimes doesn't. Okay, there are some years where you can spot right away, and some years they're kind of half fuzzy. But to remember about this, it's a one-time cost. So if it's $29, let's say you're able to generate 7 or 8 calves from that cow. You don't have to pay $29 all the time. That 50 pounds comes every year. Again, we're not looking at resistance. We're looking at tolerance. We are recapturing half of the loss that we would have had. in intake, gain, and weaning weight. There's some other things we're testing that we have finished testing on, and we're not, we'll talk about those in the coming years. There's no set recommendation. There are people who test bulls, and we have to find out more about that. They swear by it, but we don't have their data. They even have been writing stuff that I don't even know these. These are seed stock producers out west, but we need to find out more. So the bulls are being tested, but we're primarily testing heifers. That's how we use it. Management with toxic fescue. Where does this? Okay, let's talk about this a little bit. John may point this out later, but let's forget about this test for a second. Just talk about managing Kentucky 31. As a rule of thumb, in Missouri, but in many of the places in the fescue belt, right in the middle of the fescue belt, your steers will gain 1 pound a day. If you average it up at the end of the year, if they're on straight fescue, they're going to gain 1 pound a day. Now you may say, well, my steers, I weighed them, I'm gaining 1.6. You are? Then let's talk about that, because you're probably supplementing and you probably have clover. You're probably doing all this, in fact, stuff you're supposed to do, good management. But if you remove all that, remove the row grow, remove it all, you're probably going to get 1 pound a day, give or take 1/10 of a pound. If you do a summer rotation, they'll gain like crazy in the summer. They go back on fescue and you lose quite a bit, but you'll gain some. So let's say 1/4 of a pound from a summer rotation at the end of the year. If you supplement affordable rates, okay, we're not talking about substituting, but supplementing with something like a wheat mids or something, corn gluten, okay, another increment. If I add legumes, a lot of people will say, I don't have fescue problems. Well, why not? Because I have red clover. Red clover doesn't do it. Red clover brings it up. It's a big help. It's one of the major practices, but it doesn't cure it. And the beauty of novel endophytes is after you do all that, you're just huffing and puffing to catch up with what would happen with the novel endophyte anyway. And plus, if you did this with novels, the gain would go up. So that's the rule of thumb. And what we're looking at right here is this. Here's the starting place with toxic fescue. You do all this other stuff, and you can catch up. It's a recurring cost. It's not ideal management, but it's a way to survive. What we're saying here is, if you had these cattle, your grass only is halfway up already. And so that's not meant to be something to get you out of planting a novel. It's something to help plant the novels. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here's another way to look at it. Just a regular cow herd, then these that are tolerant. They're halfway there. So what does it look like? When people convert their farms from Kentucky 31 to a novel endophyte. We have some farmers who have done their whole farm, and they'll tell you, Joe referenced Daryl Franson, they'll tell you it took 7 years. Where we are in our state, we have tall fescue schools like this, but they're one-day schools, farmers and farmer panels. NRCS comes in, everybody. All of the seed companies are there. Noble Foundation, and they all do talks like you're hearing today. They're one-day talks. And in the exit interviews, exit surveys, the producers will always say, you need to add this. Well, the talk that's needed, I didn't even think of this, but the talk that's needed is management during transition years. We have management talks for how to establish a novel endophyte and manage it the first year. Then we have talks on how to manage a novel endophyte, which is not hard. It's mainly don't overgraze it. But really, what about all these 7 years it took to convert? And it can be done quicker or so, but that's what we don't have. Well, so many times a typical operation will look like this. 25% of my acres are in a novel endophyte. How do I manage? Well, this is where these cattle could be handy, because they're going to have to rotate through all these paddocks. And it would be nice to have cattle that didn't completely fall apart as if I had bought those cattle from Montana and they were naive. So that's where it helps, I think. What about if I have converted my entire farm over? well, you really don't need these cattle. And I mean, to tell you the truth, I'd like to get to the point where you didn't. That's what's better for your operation. But you can, there is a place for them. We have a producer who converted his entire farm over to novel endophytes. And when he went to sell them, you know, this only happened once, thankfully. But the buyer was skittish because he said, well, you have naive cattle. Well, he did have naive cattle. But if he had had these other cattle, they'd move right through the market and with no questions asked. Now, that only happened once. Last year, he sold his cattle before the market dropped, and he got a very good price, and they knew they were naive. The person who bought them also had a farm just like this. And so it's starting to catch on. It's not catching on quickly enough. But that's where these cattle would fit. And then, of course, they fit on any farm. That's just all Kentucky 31. That's really the easiest thing to think about. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are questions. And let me tell you before you ask them, I'll do my best, but remember, I'm an agronomist.
Yeah, you're talking about one generation here. If we raise our own heifers, replacements, have you looked into the
Heritability.
of this?
We are looking at that now. We have very little data on that. I would like to say we have more than zero data, but we need to look at that. Some of these heifers that were tested with different bulls, and they kept putting out that calf that was 50 pounds heavier. So there's something, but that's the ultimate question. I would like to say also this test came out 3 months ago, so it's very expensive to run these. So we're running them as fast as we can. Yes.
When you get your test back,
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll repeat the question. Right. Sorry.
is it yes or no, or the degrees of resistance?
There are degrees, and that's why they're start out on 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The next question on that is, he asked their degrees of tolerance. The next question is, what does the typical herd look like? In the herds that we've tested in Missouri, there are some producers who have been heavy cullers, but even on those farms, we've never seen more than 50% start out at 3, 4, or 5. So there's a lot of culling, and this is only one culling tool, but if you're culling on this, there's a lot left to be done. The worst case was someone only had, and he said he had been culling all this time, only had 20% of his cattle that were what we would call tolerant, start out at 4 or 5. So, Chris,
So you're saying, or are you saying, I've got a tolerant bull, tolerant cow, that calf is going to be tolerant 100% of the time?
No, we don't have heritability studies yet. I mean, we've got to do that. I know we've got to do that. We have enough to know that if we have a tolerant cow who's used several bulls, that calf is coming out on average 56 pounds heavier. Yes?
Do you know whether the tolerance is due to not having the prolactin level affected, or is it from not having the effective prolactin level affected before?
I don't know that. We have tested prolactin, which is a very, very noisy procedure, a lot of error in prolactin, but I don't know the answer to that. Is it related to prolactin? I can't believe that it is completely. It's probably related, because how else are we getting these gains and intake differences which are not related to prolactin? Yes? Sorry? No, and we have to have that. These are all good researchable questions for Virginia Tech. They're the questions that we ask, and we know we have to have them. We started not to even run with it, but you know, if you have 3,000 observations and it keeps dropping out the same answer, and you've seen also not just weaning weights, but also intake and gain, I think we have enough to go with that's valuable. It's a valuable test. Okay, thank you.
Craig, thank you very much.